A mummified body of a former employee, Larry Murillo-Moncada, was found behind a cooler at his work on the 24th of January 2019. Contract workers were removing shelves and coolers from the former No Frills supermarket site in Council Bluffs, Iowa, when the disturbing discovery was made. His parents reported their son missing on the 28th of November 2009 after he became upset and ran out of their home. They told police at the time that he was acting irrationally, possibly because of the medication he was taking. He was said to have been hearing voices that said, "Eat sugar." He felt his heart was beating too hard and thought that if he ate sugar, his heart would not beat so hard. He departed home when there was a snowstorm. He left with no shoes, no socks, no keys, no car, so a search party went out looking for him. The concentrated search area was in general location of his home, as well as open fields, parks, and railway yards, which were close to his home. There was never evidence or witnesses placing him at the store during the time he went missing, nor was he scheduled to work the night he went missing. The police department did not receive any call for service at that location for any suspicious fluids or smells, or viewing a body behind a large cooler unit. Investigators believe he went to the supermarket and climbed on top of the coolers. The space was used for storage for merchandise, and employees would sometimes go there to hide when they wanted to take an unofficial break. He's thought to have fallen into an 18-inch gap between the back of the cooler and a wall when he became trapped. It was the heavy duties equipment's high volume that likely led to his death, investigators said. It's so loud, there's probably no way of hearing him. An autopsy found no signs of trauma, and the case has been deemed an accidental death.
Alex Cooper of Cranbrook, British Columbia, was an accomplished musician, much-loved husband, and family man. He had 5 children and several grandchildren. He was a local businessman who worked in the cleaning industry from 1974 to 1983. In 1986, he took up a job as a salesman and began to spend some of his time on the road. In the morning of April 1987, he vanished, and his car was found abandoned near a river with fishing equipment and clothing inside. There were no signs of footprints around the car either. At first, it was believed that he either fell into the river or was abducted and killed. However, witnesses reported seeing a man matching his description, trying to hitchhike out of the area. After a year had passed, with no sign of him, Margaret stated that Alex always paid with large amounts of cash on hand. So she feared that someone may have seen this and decided to rob and kill Alex. Hospitals nearby were contracted, and an extensive air and land search began, but no trace of Alex was found. So Margaret declared him dead. When she tried to acquire his birth certificate, however, it was discovered that there hadn't been one issued in his name. In fact, prior to their marriage in 1952, there was no record of him ever existing. Alex Cooper was apparently a false identity. 4 years passed. Then in 1991, another man named David Cooper was reported missing in Toronto. In his apartment, police found a photo of Alex, confirming that the two were the same person. However, no one could understand why he was doing what he did. In September of 1991, Alex's bizarre case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. As a result of a viewer tip, he was located and the true story of his life began to unravel. He told the police that his real name was Albin Arsenault, and that in 1948, he was falsely accused of stealing from his employer. Rather than face prison time for something he didn't do, he fled, changed his name, and married Margaret. For decades, he kept his identity a secret. However, as his 65th birthday approached, he learned that he needed his birth certificate in order to get his pension. Knowing that he couldn't produce it, he decided to disappear instead of telling his family the truth. Fortunately for him, his family was understanding and accepted him back when he was reunited with them.
John Darwin was a former teacher and prison officer. He lived with his wife Anne, who was a doctor's receptionist and also ran a business renting bed sits with 12 houses in a seaside town of County Durham in the UK. They ran into debt after purchasing 2 houses in Seaton, Carew in December 2000. They racked up a massive debt of over £60,000 on their credit card and £130,000 on their mortgage. As their indebtedness spiraled out of control, it prompted Darwin to come up with a crazy idea. He decided the best way to liberate himself and Anne out of this financial burden was to fake his own death at sea, thereby leaving his grieving widow to claim his life insurance. Not long after, they'll begin a new life in Panama, forsaking their 2 grown-up sons, Mark and Anthony, who would mourn the loss of their dead dad. For 5 years the plan worked. It all started in March 2002, when Darwin put his wild plan into action. He proceeded to paddle out to sea, in his canoe, and capsized it, faking his death, and sparking a massive search and rescue operation. His body was never found. However, eventually his smashed up canoe was. Meanwhile, Anne went and collected £250,000 in life insurance payouts. During the years that Darwin was presumed dead, he lived for some time in a bedsit next door to the family home. He then secretly moved back in with his wife Anne in February 2003. Meanwhile, a death certificate was issued stating that Darwin had died on the 21st of March 2002. Sometime that year, a tenant of the block of the bedsit flats that the Darwins owned, Lee Wadrop, recognised Darwin and asked him, "Aren't you supposed to be dead?" To which Darwin replied, "Don't tell anyone about this." Wadrop later said that he had not told the police because he didn't want to get involved. Incredibly, Anne and Darwin pulled this charade off for 4 years. John would wear a wig and call himself Tom, posing as a handyman if he ever had to answer the door. As he grew more confident, he went out and about with a bushy beard. He even borrowed books from the local library under the alias John Jones. Finally, Darwin acquired a fake passport in Sunderland in the same name as his alias, using the identity of a baby who died in 1950, and the couple moved to South America to live more openly. The doting wife told their sons she needed to start a new life in the sun. With everything going well, Darwin took his next bold step, returning to the UK and walking into a police station to claim that he'd been suffering from amnesia all this time. It might have worked had a photo of the Darwins grinning happily in the Panama estate agents not been found on the internet, time-stamped, revealing he had indeed been alive all this time. A police investigation discovered that Darwin had been using the false passport, and then he had made several trips to Panama in the previous 5 years. After returning to the UK, Anne was convicted of 6 fraud charges and 9 counts of money laundering and was jailed for 6.5 years. She only served 3.5 years of this sentence. Darwin admitted to fraud, as well as one of falsely obtaining a passport, and was jailed for 6 years and 3 months. He was released in 2011 after serving half his sentence. After his release, Darwin wanted to rekindle their marriage, but Anne refused. Anne felt that he was always domineering and never listened to her. She just agreed to a lot of things because she could never win anyway. Anne added, "I didn't have the courage to do the right thing because I put all my trust in the man that I married and could not perceive a life without him." It is claimed that he faked his death because he was suicidal over his debts and feared appearing a failure to his family. Losing everything was more than he could bear. He figured that a suicide would be useless, as the insurance company wouldn't pay out, thereby faking his death seemed like the logical thing to do. While Anne lives a quiet life around York and has reconciled with her sons, Darwin married second wife Mercy May from Manila 5 years ago, less than 2 months after they met online. She is 23 years his junior.
Lorene Roberts was raised in Dripping Springs, Texas. She was on the basketball team in high school and a member of the pep club. For many years, she suffered from mental illness as she eventually dropped out of school at the age of 16. Later, she worked as a waitress in Austin, Texas. In 1949, she met a young serviceman, and in just 10 days they were married. They had 3 children, and in 1956, they moved to his hometown in New Jersey. His family disliked Lorene, and they bought her and the children train tickets to send them back to Austin, which quickly followed by a divorce. Lorene worked while her eldest child watched over the younger ones. It was, however, too much for her, so she gave them up for adoption. Her mental and emotional state worsened, and her sister Ruby admitted her to a mental institution, where she spent several years going in and out. Between 1957 and 1961, she was admitted on 5 separate occasions. Each time she was released, she found work as a waitress. However, the pressure at the job would be far too much for her, so she would readmit herself to the hospital. In 1959, Lorene showed up at her sister Ruby's house unannounced. She told her that she was engaged to a college professor. Ruby could tell that she was still not well, but she left before she could get her help. 2 weeks later, Ruby received a bill for Lorene's engagement ring. She had bought it herself, but failed to make the payments. For reasons unknown at the time, Lorene stopped contacting her family. She was last seen on February 12, 1964, when she visited another mental hospital. In 1988, her mother passed away and left a $100,000 inheritance for each of her children, including Lorene. An attorney was assigned to search for her so she could inherit the money. In 1985, Lorene's daughter, Debbie Russ, who had located her brothers in 1978, found Lorene's family and learned that she was missing. They searched for her not only to reunite with her, but to also have her receive her inheritance. They feared that she may have been homeless, living on the streets, and not knowing her identity. An episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired in 1991, which Lorene watched. She rang into the show to let them know that she was the one that they were looking for. She changed her name to Vera and had been living in Little Rock, Arkansas for the past 30 years, where she worked as a housekeeper for just room and board. Ruby collected her from Little Rock and returned her to Austin, where she reunited with her sisters, children, and other relatives. She also received her $100,000 inheritance. She stayed in Austin for several months before returning to Little Rock, before passing away in 1997 at the age of 64.
Gabriel Nagy was a doting family man to his wife Pam, 9-year-old daughter Jennifer, and 11-year-old son Stephen. On the 21st of January 1987, he made his way to his Sydney home from work for lunch. However, at this moment, his life changed forever. He had a car accident which caused him to lose his memory. He was confused and disorientated and caused him to wander off without saying a word to anyone. Later that day, his family began to panic when he didn't return home. They were devastated when they discovered his burnt-out vehicle on the side of the road, but no sign of him. 2 weeks after his disappearance, his credit card showed a charge for some camping equipment at a supplies store in Newcastle, but no discovery was made from this lead. He spent the next few years sleeping rough and drinking, living out in the wilderness. He went through a succession of jobs on fishing boats, farms, and building sites. A pastor of the church offered him a job as a caretaker and provided him with much needed support and accommodation. His life continued with no memories of the tragedy, other than the bleeding from his head. With no sign of their relative, his family had all but given up on ever hearing from him again. During most of his time away, he had been living under a pseudonym. However, he started having flashes of his proper name. Senior Constable Georgia Robinson, who was involved in the inquest into his disappearance only weeks before declaring him dead, had scanned Medicare records and discovered somebody with the same name who had recently had eye surgery. For over 20 years, Nagy had been suffering severe amnesia working odd jobs. He had effectively started over from scratch. But after making an emotional reunion with his family, many of his memories came flooding back. Scarring on the back of his head correlated to the condition of his car accident, and medical examiners believed it caused a neurological condition, placing him in a dissociative state which can cause people to wander off. Despite the positive reunion and celebrations, he didn't move back in with his family, who relocated to Queensland's Sunshine Coast after the tragedy, but he keeps in regular contact with them.
Mary Ann Ulrich went to go visit her sister, Pat Teer, a married mother of 3 young children, in the spring of 1967. As she made her way home, she had an intense, dreadful feeling. Once she arrived at Pat's house, she found her children unattended. Her daughter explained to Mary Ann that she was sleeping in the bedroom. When she entered her room, she found her lying unconscious on her bed. Doctors evaluated her and discovered that an aneurysm was blocking blood flow to her brain. An extremely risky procedure was completed, where the artery in her neck had to be clamped off. The surgery was successful, but caused an impairment to her memory, resulting in almost total amnesia. Once she awoke, she had no idea who she was, nor her sister Mary Ann, her husband, or even her children. She had to relearn everything all over again, and even how to eat. Her husband divorced her and took custody of their children, leaving her to recover and rebuild her life on her own. In November 1968, a woman who was hired to care for Pat called Mary Ann and told her that Pat had wandered off. 6 weeks later, she was found and picked up by Mary Ann in Alabama, where she had lived when she was younger. She claimed that she could not remember how she got there. Sometime later, she married a man by the name of Troy Carlton, who tried to help her with her issues, including gaining joint custody of her children. In January of 1971, she wandered off for the last time from Houston, Texas. She turned up a year later at the welfare office in San Diego. However, when the officer working contacted one of Pat's aunts, the aunt believed that Pat was still in Texas. By the time the mistake was realized, Pat had vanished again. More than 30 years had passed, and in 2004, she was found alive and well in San Francisco. Her family reported that she hadn't wandered off since. However, only 1 year after the reunion, Mary Ann passed away.